Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to our course on religions, our unit rather on religions. For this particular unit, what we are going to, or this particular section we're going to do is cover in a little bit of detail the religion of Islam, our last Abrahamic religion to cover. Now, this particular religion is a little bit unique because it comes on the heels of, or it develops on the heels of Christianity and Judaism. So what you want to generally understand in your kind of mental sequence and your mental pattern of understanding religions through history is that Judaism comes first, back in the, about 200, 1500 years before Jesus, before Christ. And then you have the emergence of Christianity in the first century. And then about 600 years after that, you have the emergence of Islam in the Middle East. Now, Islam is probably the most or the closest that we will get in our course to touching on something that is more Eastern based, aside from our covering of Hinduism and Buddhism. So Islam is the closest we will get to a much more global understanding of the humanities in this particular course. But even then, we are going to cover it in probably not enough detail to get a full gist of it. But I try to at least get my students exposed to some of the basics of Islam, just to kind of understand our interaction with it from a Western point of view. So the phrase, as I've done before, the phrase that I'm giving to you here is again a phrase that really encapsulates some of the basic basic fundamental ideas that are being put forward by Islam. Now, you're going to watch me absolutely butcher my attempt at Arabic here, but it usually it sounds, or at least I pronounce it something like La ilaha illa Muhammadur Rasulullah. Now, or however fancy and fast you want to say that. Please, all my Arabic friends, all my Arabic students, please correct me for that. But that generally means, and that's translated as, there is one God. So Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the gist. That's the thrusting point of Islam. Allah is God. Muhammad is his greatest, if you want, prophet. Okay, so just like before, we had Christos Kyrios, Christ is Lord. Before that, we had Bereshit bara Elohim Adonai. Then we had the God created in the beginning. God created things. Then we had Christianity, and we can see a similar pattern in Islam here. We're like, yep, just God, and Muhammad is our prophet we're going to focus on. So now, again, we're going to skip the essential questions. We're not interested in that stuff. In brief, Islam in brief. So basically three fundamental points. Number one, God's final revelation of himself was revealed to Muhammad and transcribed in the Quran. Okay, so that's essentially the two claims that Islam will really stick to. So if you believe those two claims, that basically qualifies you in some sense as being a Muslim. So the last revelation of God, right, the final definitive revelation of God was given to Muhammad. So Muslims will basically believe Jews and Christians have an incomplete or a corrupted understanding of God's revelation, and it is with Muhammad only that the final and fullest revelation is given. And that revelation is then transcribed depending on who you're talking to. Some Muslims will say it's transcribed word for word from basically God, via the angel Gabriel, but basically through the divine into the Quran. So the Quran is definitely seen as the word of God in Islam. It's a very it's a particularly important theological point to understand how important the Quran is to Muslims. It is not the same as the Bible is in the Christian religion. The Christians say that the Bible is the word of God in the sense that it's God breathed, right? It's God inspired. But you could, if you want to be really like nitpicky about it, you could have Christians who don't believe that the Bible is the complete inerrant word of God, and they could still be a Christian, right? Because all you need to do to be a Christian is to believe that Jesus is God. That's basically it. Like that qualifies you in terms of belief to saying that you're a Christian. The same is not true with Islam. You must believe in the Quran. That is the focal point. That is the defining point of a Muslim's belief. Is this text being basically a transcription of Allah? The second point here is that God is one who must be honored and never robbed of honor, and Muhammad is the greatest prophet. Okay, so the veneration and the authority that Muhammad has in this religion is the second major point, is that you must have veneration and honor given to Muhammad, but fundamentally honor is belonging to God, belonging to Allah. Okay. The third point is that mankind must strive to follow God's will and good deeds, right? That is our kind of purpose and our focus point in life. Follow Allah's will, his commandments, and also do good deeds to essentially earn your way into heaven. Now, the focus on God's will is usually a big point in Islam. So I want us to understand a couple different concepts right off the bat there. Islam is very focused on what is called voluntarism or voluntaristic theology, where the emphasis is on God's will. So the term Islam means submission, means kind of yielding to God's will. We need to kind of put our will aside, put the will of our own flesh, of our own interests aside, and yield to the will of Allah. In the same sense that Christianity had its focus on God, and then Judaism had its focus on God. Islam has its own unique focus. So if you want to make the comparison, Judaism focuses on God's holiness and his righteousness, right? That's the big focus there. In Christianity, it's on God's universal love, right? That's the big focus in Christianity. Whereas in Islam, it's a really big focus on his will, right? We need to really understand that it's his will that needs to be focused on. Now, that's not, again, to say that they don't agree with each other on those focuses. Like, I think Muslims will acknowledge to some degree that God does have love. Well, the terminology, as we will see, is more along the lines of mercy, is that God is merciful, Allah is merciful. Whereas Christians will also acknowledge, no, God's will is very important, because of how loving he is. And then same thing with the Jews, they will say the exact same thing. So understand that these religions do overlap with their understanding of God, and a lot of the times it's the focus that we get a little bit hung up on within the differences of these particular religions, which are important and good to notice, but they're there, and we need to kind of understand the uniqueness of all of them and then move from there. Basically, we got two forms of Islam. Sunni Muslims, or Sunni Islam, which is the largest denomination, as it says here, believe that Muhammad did not give a clear successor. So once Muhammad completes, his work on earth, he dies, and there's no clear understanding as to who is supposed to lead forth the Muslims afterwards. And as it says here, its favorite focus on Muhammad's behavior as an exemplar, right? So they like to focus on Muhammad as their exemplar, which is a fancy way of saying they like to act as he acted. They like to use his behavior and his teachings as their main example moving forward in the world. This is in contrast to the Shia Muslims, or the Shia Islam, which is a denomination that believes, as it says, that Muhammad appointed his son-in-law to be a successor. So we have a clear succession here. And of course, this favors focus on Muhammad's bloodline. So it's more royal in that sense. It kind of follows that sort of monarchical, genealogical understanding quite a bit. Okay, so two basic groups there. That's what we got. Now, the general history of Islam, like I said, it begins in the 6th, or technically the 5th or 7th century AD. With 610, Muhammad is visited by the angel Gabriel. So Muhammad begins as the story of Islam goes, he begins his journey from the standpoint of being a illiterate man in the Middle East, and he is visited by an angelic figure who is usually understood to be the angel Gabriel. And this angel essentially almost compels him and kind of like really presses him to transcribe the truths of the Quran. And this is seen as one of the major miracles in Islam, is that this man who is completely illiterate is able to be so inspired and so moved by the divine force and nature that he creates this very structured, very poetic, and very sophisticated text in the form of the Quran. So then we have 633 AD. Muhammad does die after a prolonged illness, and thus, kicking off that whole conflict with the Shia and the Sunni division. And then in 1099, we have the Crusaders taking Jerusalem from the Muslims. Eventually, the Muslims defeat the Crusaders, right? So there's a big conflict, of course, during the medieval ages between the Muslims and the European Christians over who deserves to control Jerusalem. Now, in 1930, the Nation of Islam is created in the U.S. by, I forget the guy's name, by W.D. Fard. Now, that highlights for us the kind of interesting thing about the modern era, as we're going to see when we get there in a couple of units, in a few units, is that the relevance of of simply looking at history through a kind of more Eurocentric perspective causes problems, because it's going to be difficult for us in the West to understand Islam fully. And it's going to be difficult for us to understand how to interact with other religions, other faiths, the more that we expand as human beings, right? It's kind of the nice thing that we have right now in our current day and age, is that we are living in a very global or globalized world right now, where everyone essentially has contact with everyone, or we could have contact with everybody. So we're all being exposed to a lot of different perspectives and worldviews and a lot of different history that we would not have otherwise. So, major figures in Islam. We have the Prophet Muhammad, of course, the founder of the religion, viewed as the final and greatest prophet and the exemplar of the faith, right? We like to really emphasize in Islam that whatever Muhammad is doing, we are seeing that there's something that is good in what he is doing that we should emulate. We should kind of mimic what he is doing. He started, again, as a literate tribesman, becomes religious and military leader of Islam. Okay, so he was, this mildly controversial point, but he was a military leader. He did try to unite and in times conquer the different tribes and areas in his surrounding region to kind of spread Islam and create something like an empire, something like a unified nation for Islam. Now, Abu Bakr is the father-in-law of Muhammad, probably the other major figure, as the first Muslim outside of his family that was converted to Islam and viewed the Sunnis as Muhammad's true successors. Okay. Now, I've given a depiction of the prophet over here. I think that I can't remember if that's supposed to be Muhammad or Abu Bakr. I think it's most likely Abu Bakr. Simply because, as you probably well know, most people know this, at least culturally or in tangent, Muslims do not want to depict Muhammad. They will not ever show his face, so they usually show him veiled in some sense there. That's just to basically honor his prophetic status, honor his holy status in the religion, in similar ways to, as we talked about last time, how we would see Moses's face being too difficult or being too holy for us to look at directly. We see the same thing in this particular practice here. So we talked about the Quran already, and we're going to look in some detail at the Quran, but we're kind of breaking from strict Muslim tradition here, because if you think about it, if the Quran was the transcribed word of God, then God intends, or that there seems to be some link between the holy and divine nature and the language of Arabic. Now, we don't speak Arabic. I don't speak Arabic, unfortunately, as gorgeous of a language and as a text as it seems to be. We still need to translate it into English, which some Muslims will be, a little more strict about and say that that's technically not the true Quran. It's not the true transcribed word of God if you translate it, because we're putting it through that filter of translation that it did not originally go through. But c'est la vie. We still have to try to understand it. So we have a couple different passages, three general passages I'm going to look at, or rather two passages and a collection of passages. So let's jump right into the reading. The first one is a close reading, as you saw over here, on the concept of God, right? The concept of Allah. So it comes from chapter 2, verse 22 of the Quran, and it reads as follows. Allah, there is no deity except Him, the ever-living and the sustainer of all existence. Neither drowsiness overtakes him nor sleep. To him belongs whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth. Who is it that can intercede with him except by his permission? He knows what is presently before them and what will be after them, and they encompass not a thing of his knowledge except for what he wills. His kursi, that is his throne, extends over the heavens and the earth, and his preservation tires him not. Their preservation tires him not. And he is the most high, the most great. Okay, so basic ideas here that I like my students to jump with or to be guided by. Identify the titles associated with Allah. Okay, so let's take a look. First title, the ever living and the sustainer of all existence. Okay, ever living. This emphasizes what we already talked about in our previous videos on religion, which is that God is everlasting. God is eternal. God exists beyond and before space and time. Now, the sustainer of all title here essentially describes something that we talked a little bit about with monotheism, but we see again the roots of, and we see a consistency with when we look at a religion like Judaism or Christianity, which is that God as being the creator and the source of existence, it also acts as the sustainer of existence. It is only through God's divine providence and power that the world and all of existence around him is sustained. Okay, so same thing in Islam. Let's see, what other titles can we see here? Da 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 da. Now we see the last two here, the most high, the most great. Okay, the most high, right? The highest point of value, the highest point of power and authority, the highest point of goodness, the highest point of perfection. This is all very classic theology right here, again, stuff that both Judaism and Christianity would agree with. The most great, okay, same thing, right? It's basically a reverberation of that previous title. So we have those basic four titles here. Three characteristics of Allah from this passage using three direct quotes. Yeah, so let's take a look. There is no deity except him. Okay, again, so going back to that theological joke from the first video on religion, define God and give two examples. You can't. You can only give one example, and that's God, right? There is only one thing that is like God. Islam is definitely going to pick up the same fervor for monotheism that we saw in Judaism. It is strictly monotheistic. They are really, really hardcore about this. You cannot equate anything with Allah that is going to essentially be committing the sin or close to committing the sin of what the Jews would call idolatry, but what the Muslims would call shirk, right? When you're giving something praise due to God, something that is not actually God. Okay. Neither drowsiness overtakes him nor sleep. In other words, God, has no reserves, has no need for reservation of power. God is always, invigorated with power. To him belong whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth. In other words, he is as the supreme being and creator, he is also the owner of all things, right? So all the things that exist are essentially his dominion. That includes time, that includes space, that includes our lives, that includes our possessions. It is all his, essentially, fundamentally. It's a deep spiritual point that we see basically, again, in all of the Abrahamic faiths, which is that we are subservient, essentially, to God. Everything that we have is a gift from God. Yeah. Now, to him belongs this. Who is it that can intercede with him except by his permission? In other words, like he is sovereign over whatever he wants and whatever he wants to listen to. He knows what is before and after them, what will be after them. He encompasses all things of his knowledge except for what he wills. In other words, he has omniscience. He knows all of time and space. He knows about everything that will happen to us. He knows about everything that has happened to us or that could happen to us. This is, again, just an expression of omniscience, but respective to the concept of time, the concept of foreknowledge of what's going to happen in the future. His throne extends over the heavens and the earth, and his preservation tires him not. In other words, yeah, he has this dominion status over the world. He has this lordship, this kingship over all of existence, and he's able to preserve it without any tiring, any tiresome, any fatigue on his part. Again, referencing back to not only his lordship, but his omnipotence. Okay, his power is able to do all of this. Now, what can you infer about Islam's view of God based on this? And I kind of hinted at this with this particular section here with this particular picture here, we see that the throne and the transcendence of God and the dominion and the power of God is the major focus of the theology of Islam, right? That God is, again, characterized like the king on the throne. That is essentially what we see in Islam. He is a transcendent God because of this. Now, for number 4, how is this belief similar and unique to the Abrahamic religions that we have studied? I think the major way that it is similar is because it's affirmed by all the other faiths as well. I mean, Christianity would not deny anything that we have heard here. Judaism would not deny anything we have heard here. The only thing that they would do, and this is where I think we're a little bit different, we see a difference, is that they would differ in how much they emphasize these features, and they would differ on how much they emphasize other features. So, like, for example, this transcendence of God thing, yes, Judaism agrees with it, Christianity agrees with it, but as we just saw in the last video, Christianity really also emphasizes the other side, the immanence of God, kind of the closeness of God. We don't see as much of that in Islam, and this is why if you ever do a comparative religious class or listen to a comparative religious discussion, this is a relatively foreign and sort of interesting topic to a lot of Muslims. They don't usually understand God in that very deeply personal and intimate way. It's a little bit more removed, right? There's a little bit more of a severe amount of reverence, which some Christians and some Jews actually do relate to quite a bit. Is this intense reverence of God? So much so that they will use reverential rituals and reverential language when they refer to him. Okay, so we saw a little bit of that in Judaism for sure, but again, Islam really highlights that to a serious degree. Now, the second views or second reading we have is, as it says, going to be like controversial, not controversial, but a variety of views or a variety of subjects. So this is surah number 2. It's the passage from surah number 2, and it's got a couple different sort of random subjects that I'd like to kind of throw at my students just to kind of give them an idea of what's sort of in the Quran. It says, "They will ask you about wine and al-maisar. Say, in them both is sin and profit to men. But the sin of both is greater than the profit of the same." All right. So this is a condemnation in the Quran of wine, in other words, like alcohol, as well as what this word really means is quick or kind of easily gotten or swiftly gotten wealth. So Islam is, again, concerned with alcohol. They don't like alcohol. Muslims do not drink alcohol because they see it as something corrupt, something that's going to lead to a negative outcome, as well as someone who gets quick wealth for a bunch of different reasons. They see that this is a particularly dangerous thing. Now, additionally, it goes on to say, "They will ask you what they shall expend in alms. Say, the surplus. Thus does God manifest to you his signs. Happily, you may reflect on this world and the next." In other words, yes, give alms, give charity, give away some of your wealth. Sounds very familiar from Christianity. "They will ask thee about orphans. Say, to do good to them is best, but if you interfere with them, they are your brethren, and God knows the evildoer from the well-doer. And if God will, he will surely trouble you. Verily, God is mighty and wise." So that phrase, by the way, that kind of repetitive phrase, "God is mighty and wise, God is merciful and just," like that's a very typical kind of poetic, rhetorical pattern that we will see in the Quran. The more you read it, that kind of repetition of this phrasing of what God's character is like. But again, we see here an indictment against people who would treat orphans poorly, and a kind of incitement into treating orphans well and taking care of them. "Wed not with idolatrous women until they believe, for surely a believing handmaiden is better than an idolatrous woman, even though she please you. And wed not the idolatrous men until they believe, for a believing slave is better than an idolater, even though he please you. Those invite you to fire, but God invites you to paradise, and pardon by his permission, and makes his clear signs to men. Happily they may remember." Okay, so a little bit more of an interesting kind of harsh teaching here. We have this precedent in Islam that you are not meant to marry or enter into a romantic relationship with someone who is idolatrous. In other words, someone who is committing shirk, someone who is not a Muslim. This is not allowed. This is seen as a particularly poor thing. You must have someone who has submitted to the will of Islam, the will of Allah, before you can join with them in marriage. Okay, this is inviting you to, as it says, to fire, to hell. This is an invitation to destruction in some way. This is going to lead to something very, very negative. Right? God does not want this. God invites you to paradise and His pardon. You know, go that way, not this way. Okay. Your women are your tilth. So come into your tillage how you come, but do previous good act for yourselves and fear God and know that you are going to meet Him and give good tidings unto those who believe. Okay, again, showing that you need to take care of women, you need to take care of your, the things around you, all this kind of stuff. Fear God. Again, don't act in a negative way against your belongings, against the people in your life. Simple stuff. Make not God the butt of your oaths, that you will keep clear and fear and make peace among them. For God both hears and knows. He will not catch you up for a casual word in your oaths, but He will catch you up for what your hearts have earned. But God is forgiving and clement. Again, don't swear oaths to God because you may fall back on them, and this would be a terrible thing. Avoid that kind of stuff. This is also very similar to what we see in the Old Testament. That's a very obvious teaching there. Divorced women must wait for themselves 3 courses, and it is not lawful that they may hide what God has created in their wombs. If they believe in God and in the last day, their husbands will do better to take them back in that case if they wish to reconcile, for the same is due for them as for men. But the men should have precedence over them. God is mighty and wise. Okay, so at this point in the reading, I like to stop my students and ask them if we can see any comparative differences between, and again, we kind of already answered most of these things, is that we can see any major comparative differences between the texts of the Abrahamic faith. We've looked at 2 passages from the Quran now. We've looked at a handful of passages from Christianity and from Judaism. What are the major differences here? The major difference, I think, is, to put it in a very simplified way, is that Islam's holy text is much more prescriptive than it is narrative. It teaches through prescription, right? As we can see here, we're getting clear instructions, not necessarily entirely clear and detailed, but it's instructions. We're being told what to do, essentially. We are being told directly what God is like. It is direct characterization, is direct guidance. Whereas in Christianity, especially, God is much more indirect. His characterization is indirect. It is demonstrated through parables, through narration, through interaction with other people. That's kind of how we learn how God is. It's very rare that we get this type of a prescription in Christianity, with the exception of like Paul's letters or Jesus's direct teachings. But there's a mixture at best between narrative and prescriptive. Here, less so. There's much, much more proscriptive sort of a text. Okay, now what I usually have students do is take a look at this third close reading, where I basically have them select at least 5 passages to read. And then we have a passage from the Quran on the concept of God, the concept of a Muslim, faith, justice, equality in virtue, veiling, marriage, divorce, respect to parents, motherhood, the nature as a sign, nature, that is the natural world as a sign of God, coexistence, and all that sort of stuff. So I like to have them select 5 of these. I would like you to do the same thing if you're following along with us. Select 5 of those and try to summarize what it is that Islam is basically teaching and advocating for here. Okay. Now, that's basically it. We're going to, again, I said, we're going to blast through Islam very, very quickly. Now, a couple things to notice here. Islam is a complex religion to understand. It is a much more proscriptive religion. And so it opens up itself to a lot of, I wouldn't say criticism, but a lot more interpretation, a lot more of a different kind of interpretation that we are not necessarily used to in the West. We have in Islam a lot of clear prescriptions, which might on its surface level seem very simple, therefore, to understand what it's advocating for. But just like with laws and just like with something like the 10 Commandments, the interpretation of Islam will be more along the lines of how do we apply these and how, in what situations do these remain valid and do these remain entirely true guidelines. That's really the trick with Islam. Whereas in Christianity and Judaism, we have a lot more of the kind of understanding what it is that's being taught in the narrative, and thus the interpretation will look totally different. And the whole way that we interpret things is very, very different in Islam than it is in Christianity and Judaism, okay? So a really quick overview, a quick look at the various views, and a quick look at the basic concepts. Yes, we are moving a lot quickly through this one. That is in part because of my own general ignorance of it, but it's also in part because the text we're going to look at and the history we're going to look at does not involve Islam as much as it does the other two Abrahamic faiths. Now, in the next video, we are going to cover a religious seminar. We're going to do a one-person-led Socratic seminar where we're going to tackle three difficult questions about the religions that we've covered, or religion in general. And like we did with Judaism, we had something that corresponded to Judaism, we had something that corresponded to Christianity. The rise of criticisms of Islam and the kind of complex place that it has taken in this world, I chose to have my students discuss and have a seminar where they analyze and think critically about the contributions of religion, both positive and negative. All right, and that is what we will discuss in the next video. So we will tackle how it is that we are able to understand how religion, what role religion plays in the world and in history, both for good and for ill. All right, so we will see you next time for that video. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.